Dark Souls is pure horror. On its surface, it is an ambiguous Dark Quest fantasy, but the underlying themes and gameplay mechanics of Dark Souls construct a horror that is rarely found and often impossible to capture effectively in most media. And no, this horror does not stem from the game's imagery of grotesque monsters and torture, as those fall under the umbrella of more standard horror tropes. Neither is this horror found in the game's grim visions of unstoppable decay, although that can certainly add a layer of existential dread to the overall player experience. Rather, at its greatest, Dark Souls creates a space for exploring the horror of meaning itself, or more accurately, the lack thereof. This terror of Dark Souls lies in its simulation of the postmodern crisis of meaning, employing the purposelessness itself as a monster. Throughout this essay, we will analyze how Dark Souls simulates a meaning crisis by confronting its players with the purely material nature of Lordran's meta-narratives. To do so, the discussion will trace the relation between hollowing and the search for meaning in Dark Souls through an examination of its illusions, poetic qualities, constructions of heroic player identity, narrative contradictions, historical subjectivity, and the Age of Fire regime in Lordran. Ultimately, this analysis should display how the experience of playing Dark Souls lets us conceptualize the nature of meaning in game and in life. Note, many of these interpretations can also be applied to Dark Souls 3, however Dark Souls 3 contains enough differences in tone, aesthetics, and gameplay to warrant a separate discussion of its horror. So, for the purposes of this video, we will be examining the first Dark Souls entirely in isolation from other Souls games. Additionally, the summaries of the philosophical concepts in this video will be quite brief, so I encourage you to do your own research. This project has taken more than 200 hours of research, writing, and video editing, so if you are a connoisseur of dark/grimdark media analysis and would like to see more essays of this kind, please consider liking, subscribing, and maybe even leaving me a small tip for a cup of coffee. There was a horrendous amount of coffee involved in the making of this video. And so with that out of the way, please get comfortable, get yourself some food, relax, and enjoy the video. First of all, let us have a little summary of Dark Souls. Or alternatively, you can skip this part by going to the next timestamp. Dark Souls presents a rich fantasy setting full of subtle environmental storytelling and lore complex enough for some content creators to devote entire YouTube channels just to exploring it. But for our discussion, what we really need to remember is that Dark Souls takes place in Lordran, a once flourishing land ruled by a self-proclaimed god, Lord Gwyn. The world, as it is presented, is only possible because long ago, the first flame, like we're talking the first flame, appeared and became a fuel for the world. This time frame became known as the Age of Fire, and it is thanks to this power of the flame that Lord Gwyn would go on to create the realm of Lordran. But as the game begins, it is revealed that the first flame is fading, threatening to extinguish and plunge the world into an age of darkness. Meanwhile, we, the players, are one of the many undead, functionally immortal human beings that fill the now apocalyptic lands of Lordran. While this inability to die may seem like a blessing, the predominant narrative in the setting labels undeath as a curse because the undead cannot truly die even if they wish to. And even worse, every undead is destined to go hollow, to lose sight of their reason for existing and become but a mindless husk of their former selves. But we, new players, are no hollows, because as soon as we begin our playthrough, we are given a meaningful purpose.
Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringest the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know.
Throughout the game, we quest through Lordran, cutting down gods, absorbing their souls, and eventually reaching the kiln of the first flame, where we defeat the husk of Gwyn and are then able to rekindle the fire with our very own flesh. Alright, that was an extremely reductive summary, but it will just have to do. For way deeper lore dives, I highly recommend checking out Vatividia and Hawkshaw. Just wonderful content there. Alright, moving on. Let us lay down some starting premises. For a given digital world to function, video game designers must create internal game logics and mechanisms. These processes hold a persuasive power over their players. Ian Bogost, a leading video game rhetorician, titled this persuasive power as procedural rhetoric. He explains the premise as follows.
Video games do not simply distract or entertain with empty, meaningless content. Rather, video games can make claims about the world. But when they do so, they do it not with oral speech, nor in writing, nor even with images. Rather, video games make argument with processes. Procedural rhetoric is the practice of effective persuasion and expression using processes. Since assembling rules together to describe the function of systems produces procedural representation, assembling particular rules that suggest a particular function of a particular system characterizes procedural rhetoric.
So, essentially, procedural rhetoric is the persuasion of players through the game processes. As an example, Bogost mentions Molly Industria's McDonald's video game, in which the players are offered a set of game mechanics that incentivize them to make unethical decisions for the sake of profit, like lobbying against environmentalist groups. Had McDonald's made a game about itself, it is quite unlikely that lobbying politicians would have been a game mechanic, since that would have portrayed the company from a distinctly corrupt angle. As such, the in-game models of reality make reality claims that players must to some degree accept to engage with the game. So following Bogost's logic, we can examine the argumentation embedded in the game mechanics of Dark Souls and highlight what Dark Souls reveals about the current state of reality. And when considering the overarching story, gameplay, and themes of Dark Souls, the game presents a procedural model of the postmodern crisis of meaning. Okay, so don't get scared. The following is a necessary info to get everyone on the same page for the rest of the argument. I'm going to very roughly simplify postmodernism. In his book, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge, Jean-François Lyotard defines postmodernism as follows.
An incredulity toward metanarratives, to the obsolescence of the metanarrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds, most notably, the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution, which in the past relied on it. The narrative function is losing its functors, its great hero, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal.
To define metanarratives or master grand narratives, these are our societal stories that validate all of our other smaller stories, especially in a historical sense. For example, let's take nationalism. The idea that one's nation is a great transcendental concept that is worth giving one's life for has justified actions, laws, wars, etc., which gives the people embracing this meta-narrative a purpose, place, and identity. However, when examining the validity of this narrative, it can be endlessly deconstructed, revealing that nationalism is ultimately a man-made concept that propagates cycles of oppression against the other. And that is essentially what postmodern thinkers were concerned with, the deconstruction of these major narratives. The horrors of World War I and World War II revealed that humanity was not intrinsically any more enlightened than it had been in the previous centuries. The narrative that mankind will only continue to improve through reason, science, and technology was destabilized, and the prospect of humanity simply ending itself suddenly seemed far more probable. As a result, the virtue of modern human progress became questionable, and suddenly modernity began to seem doomed and meaningless. Then, in the 1950s, thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and many others stepped in and continued to deconstruct our cultural meta-narratives, following the traditions of earlier philosophers like Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud. Now, the meaning of, well, everything we do has been broken down to the degree that the very concept of meaning is under question. Religion, science, the notion of progress now all seem like material inventions of the human condition, rather than some universal truths that we have discovered. So, if our meta-narratives are not based on an objective truth, then where does the legitimization of everything we do come from? What gives our actions intrinsic meaning? Are we really just soulless automatons that seek to keep being for the sake of nothing greater than being itself? And therein lies, at least in part, this century's crisis of meaning. Now, we are still in a Dark Souls essay, having more or less established what makes metanarratives and the basis of today's meaning crisis. We can now look at Dark Souls as a simulation of this postmodern state of meaninglessness. Dark Souls is deeply concerned with nihilism, so much so that nihilism is represented as a physical force and as an actual game mechanic. That, of course, being hollowing. As mentioned previously, hollowing is the process of becoming a mindless husk, which we can argue comes as a result of losing one's meaning for existence. The undead in Lordran, cursed to come back again and again after death, are all at risk of going hollow. While we see this process all over Lordran, some notable examples include Sigmar of Katarina, a knight who is deprived of a meaningful adventure because of players' frequent help, making his achievements not his own. Laurentis of the Great Swamp, a pyromancer that derived meaning from learning pyromancies, yet was blocked from any further studies. And, of course, the Crestfallen Knight, a man who made guiding the other undead on the quest to ring the bells of awakening his one purpose, which he was ultimately deprived of once the player successfully rang those bells. The loss of meaning in these cases causes all these characters to go hollow, and in a brilliant From Software fashion, the player is not immune to this condition. Many members of the community have suggested that when a player quits the game, their character goes hollow. The saved game file of the character remains defeated, unattended by the player, a hollow husk without a mind. This interpretation of the game mechanics is very meta, but it perfectly aligns with the game's already established meta elements, like the in-game deaths being authenticated as a part of the narrative, and the multiplayer requiring the player to use in-game items instead of simply loading in through the main menu. Players can derive meaning from a plethora of sources, be it from the gameplay satisfaction of overcoming a challenge, pursuit of a certain game experience like making special build, or just aesthetic and fulfillment of exploring a game space. We play games for our own reasons, and Dark Souls is no exception. Generally, at least in one's first playthrough, the goal is to beat Dark Souls, but have you ever started a Dark Souls playthrough with, say, a different goal? Like making a character build with a special weapon? I have several times at this point, and each time I have completed my build, I lost the desire to keep playing my character. The destination never quite compares to the journey. Perhaps adding additional goals like beating Gwyn with a specific weapon could carry one further than making a specific build, but either way, the moment the goal is complete, one has to find a new goal or begin to go hollow. For the fulfillment of a goal is the same as a loss of a goal. Since hollowing triumphs over us only when we lose our sense of meaning, upholding one's meaning in playing the game becomes a counter-mechanic to going hollow, which prompts us to reflect on how Dark Souls treats player meaning throughout its gameplay. When considering Dark Souls from the angle of monster studies, this hollowing that players continually confront throughout their journey functions as the ultimate monster of the narrative, being the underlying source of anxiety and terror in Dark Souls. We see the sentiment reflected in the discourse surrounding the game, with the slogan, "Don't go hollow," superseding other warnings like, "Don't step into the basilisk smoke," which isn't really even something that people say. The primary community warning has become the resistance to going hollow. While one can die ad infinitum in Dark Souls, to the point where dying is often treated as a comedy in community,
Thank you, Dark Souls.
hollowing is a far more serious matter. Hollowing is a monster, a continually hunting presence incarnated through the countless husks we encounter in our travels. Monsters are vessels of their cultures, embodying a variety of social values from fears to desires. Monsters do not appear out of vacuums, instead emerging out of cultural contexts, making the examination of monsters in our media more than just entertainment, but an insight into the human condition. Thus, the representation of hollowing is seen through our current cultural moment, that being the wake of postmodernity, and as such, hollowing can be understood as a postmodern apparition, a representation of contemporary nihilism and its relationship with humanity. One could also make a similar argument for the dark itself in Dark Souls, an encroaching force of change that holds a monstrous allure behind it. The dark is a distant backdrop of the setting, an existential threat of a change to the status quo. Hollowing, on the other hand, is a much more immediate and a constant threat, the shadow of nihilism. At any time, we are less than a defeat away from losing who we are. Halloween feeds on this uncertainty, on any doubt that players might experience in their purpose. It is always trailing us, waiting for us to become tired or bored of our goals, so that it may render all of our accomplishments into a heap of meaningless fragments. And this metagame mechanic is arguably the greatest contributing factor in the creation of the existential horror inside of Dark Souls. So, having now established the active roles of meaning and hollowing inside of Dark Souls, let us finally understand how the two confront one another in our journey through Lordran.
We are amidst strange beings in a strange land. The flow of time itself is convoluted, with heroes centuries old phasing in and out. The very fabric wavers, and relations shift and obscure.
Borrowing a term from Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy, a book providing a taxonomic analysis of rhetorical devices in fantasy stories, Dark Souls begins as a quest fantasy, marked by the presence of a quest driving the narrative and a monosemic interpretation of the fantasy world. That is to say, the world is initially presented through the lens of a noble quest in which the player is the righteous individual rising against all odds to overcome darkness and rekindle the fire in the age of a dying light. This quest framework is apparent from the player's earliest impressions of Lordran, seen in the beautiful intro cinematic. The intro is a lore primer that gives the players a common knowledge about the setting. This information is portrayed as universal by the fact that no matter what background or ethnicity the player chooses in the character creation, they are still shown the same narrative in the cinematic. Notably, this information is not unbiased in its representation of reality. Ideas of what is good and what is evil are deeply embedded in the language of this narrative. When the narrator is talking about the fading of the light, there is a very clear tonal bias that positions the fading of fire through a negative lens. And besides the tone, the bias is also found within the narrator's choice of words.
But soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now, there are only embers. And man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark side.
So, even without explicitly saying dark bad and light good, the coming of the night is presented as an encroaching reality that is inferior to the Age of Fire through negative words like but, only, and accursed. The opening cinematic could have as easily delivered that information with a very different tone and diction that portrayed the coming of darkness from a more neutral or perhaps even positive angle, but it did not. To further support this interpretation, we can also look at the narration from the angle of genre, because it is a generic trope for fantasy stories to begin with a lore summary that establishes the current regime, the good, and the coming evil that must be stopped by the protagonist. Just two examples include the beginning of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, establishing Sauron and the Ring as the antagonistic forces, and the beginning of The Hobbit does the same thing with Smaug and the Arkenstone. So, as a genre audience, we are primed to interpret fantasy intros through the lens of good and evil, and by presenting a generic fantasy intro cinematic, Dark Souls lets us project that same dynamic onto its intro, therefore priming us as the game's protagonists, destined to stop an evil. And thus we begin Dark Souls with the lens of the setting's primary meta-narrative. The Age of Fire is a good that must be upheld. And that is exactly what that is, a meta-narrative that has justified the Age of Fire regime. As we begin our journey through Lordran, this presupposition is our main framework for interpreting the world of Dark Souls. But while a traditional fantasy narrative, like Lord of the Rings, lets one go through the entire story with a monosemic lens, with the good and evil being mostly clear, Dark Souls dramatically subverts this expectation over the course of the game. By starting the players out with the setting's meta-narrative, Dark Souls positions them to deconstruct their own quest to simulate a gradual loss of meaning. Remember the first time we were fooled by a mimic? We dropped our guard for the promise of treasure, and a chest sprouted arms and teeth and ate us. Well, in that moment Dark Souls eroded our trust in reality. Suddenly we recognized the possibility that things were not as they appeared, and that reality required even greater scrutiny than we might have thought. So, Lordran, to say the least, is a confusing place. It is a space of illusions and abstracted meanings. While initially, players might be more or less grounded in the setting and their quest, the game world steadily demonstrates its potential for duplicity. Witnessing illusions at work reminds us of how uncertain our perception of reality truly is. Throughout Dark Souls, we encounter a myriad of illusions, from magical walls and mimics to invisible bridges, and even the sun itself turns out to be a product of illusions. Not to mention that we are often outright lied to by NPCs and the messages of other players. And the presence of all these abstractions complicates the world of Dark Souls, leaving us wondering, if not this, then what is real? This theme of false reality culminates in the death of our dear companion, Solaire. In Lost Izalith, Solaire's quest for his own sun comes to an end. And while he rejoices in the sunlight, to us he is clearly deceived by a parasite lashed onto his head. But the very presence of such a deception undermines the certainty of all we see in-game, as we are exposed to the potential of experiencing a false reality inside of Dark Souls. How do we know that we won against the sunlight maggots and were not simply enthralled in a false reality like Solaire? And from a meta angle, we are well aware that Dark Souls is a game simulating a fictional journey, thereby adding another layer of unrealness to all that we see. We do not inhabit a reality, but rather a representation of one. On a quick side note, if you are interested in a further exploration of illusions in Dark Souls, Angela Maria Andriano's essay, Enjoying the Uncertainty, How Dark Souls Performs Incompleteness Through Narrative, Level Design, and Gameplay, does a great job at looking at Dark Souls from the angle of the sublime, examining how the circular and vertical level design creates an illusion of vastness in gameplay. Good stuff. Returning to the main argument. The ideas of truth and meaning in Dark Souls are further complicated through the poetic qualities of the game. The lore of Dark Souls is not a thing you can just sit down and read holistically, at least not as a linear narrative in the game itself. Rather, this lore is scattered around the game world and its loading screens. The order in which one engages with Dark Souls' storytelling and the degree of completion, based on the sheer number of variables alone, create different perceptions of the world for everyone that plays Dark Souls. For example, when accounting for hollowing as an actual gameplay mechanic, quitting Dark Souls functions as a definitive conclusion to the story, making even the abandoned playthroughs into their own authentic narratives. Additionally, midway through the game, even the travel through the world gains a fragmented poetic quality through the bonfire warping, which further destabilizes a sense of linearity in the Dark Souls story. Which is only further reinforced by the DLC, which outright lets us traverse back and forth through time itself. This fragmented presentation of Dark Souls' story, in combination with its layers of metaphors and open-endedness, all contribute to a distinctly poetic game experience. So from a media theory angle, a major reason behind the frequent player confusion about what the game stands for comes down to the affordances of its poetic qualities clashing with what initially appears to be a standard fantasy story. To conceptualize the significance of this poetic turn in Dark Souls, we must think of the affordances and function of poetry as a medium. Jacques Derrida, a cornerstone post-structuralist thinker, identified the unique function of the poet as follows.
The poet is the man of metaphor, while the philosopher is interested only in the truth of meaning, beyond even signs and names, and the sophist manipulates empty signs. The poet plays on the multiplicity of signifieds.
This excerpt is essentially saying that poetry, by its nature, embraces a multiplicity of meanings, resisting a single concluding interpretation through its ambiguous qualities. The Western philosophical tradition, in its search for a single big meaning, is unsettled by the possibility of many meanings. And similarly, the poetics of Dark Souls further undermine the certainty of player interpretations, making the possibility of this single true meaning all the more impossible to even begin imagining. Even when beating Dark Souls, one may be left with, to say the least, a mild confusion. As Zachman wonderfully puts it,
"What the fuck did I just play?"
On a minor side note, the poetic elements of Dark Souls may also contribute to the popularity of the Dark Souls lore channels, because the game's open-endedness can leave players confused, enabling members of the community to piece together narratives that are almost more satisfying than the actual experience of playing Dark Souls. VaatiVidya especially has capitalized in this confusion, creating delightful cinematic explanations of a game that at this point feel like an essential supplement for any From Software experience. Plus, narrowing down the choices of meaning by presenting a fragmented poem as a holistic story, to some could be a point of comfort, providing a sense of completion to the game. But again, Dark Souls is compatible with endless interpretation. And what separates Dark Souls from so many of its counterparts is that From Software had chosen to actively embrace this aesthetic of polysemy, or many meanings, forcing their players to confront the possibilities of interpretation. And so it is on this foundation of poetic uncertainty that Dark Souls makes its players question their quest and their meaning. Dark Souls also encourages us to deconstruct its meta-narratives by putting the individuality of our quest to question. Dark Souls does not hold the player's hand, forcing one to find their own way through the world. Classic Souls essay one-liner. This exercise of the self creates a sense that one's journey is unique, at first glance serving as an authentic expression of selfhood. The Chosen Undead as a label celebrates the uniqueness of the individual pursuing the quest. While it is true that all undead could be the chosen, our successes indicate that it is we and not any other undead who are the true chosen. A single hero rising against the unforgiving world, raging against the coming of the night, and completing the nigh impossible quest. And this notion is only further reinforced by the difficulty narrative surrounding the game, with the achievement of beating Dark Souls being treated as a personal badge of honor. However, there is a deep dissonance contained in this interpretation. In our travels, we encounter the bodies of those who have fallen on the very same quest. The dead and the hollows mark almost every corner of Lordran. Together, these bodies reinforce the sense of player success in questing further than others, while simultaneously reminding that the prospect of going hollow follows one like a thirsting shadow. But in a postmodern/posthuman sense, these husks also imply that the player's success is not entirely their own, but a product of a greater system of bodies, both dead and living. We are not some special individuals for going on this quest. Rather, we are individuals situated in a culture built around this one single purpose. The Age of Fire regime had built, or perhaps repurposed, the Bells of Awakening to accommodate the Undead quest, and the Sands Fortress to further filter out unworthy individuals, further demonstrating the manufactured quality of the heroic journey. Which reminds us that we are not exercising our will over the world, but the will of those who had made the quest for us. So as a result, our success is presented not as a great impossible triumph, but as a designed element of our quest. Additionally, the player is never fully alone in their accomplishments, which nibbles away at the narrative of personal success. The quest literally begins with another undead sacrificing their life for us to escape our prison cell, reinforcing the idea that our success is ultimately not just our own. The Undead prophecy is a communal quest, an idea illustrated by the player's constant contact with spirits of other players. In our journey, we encounter countless others who have already walked our exact same steps. As such, we confront the manufacturedness of the Dark Souls experience, taking away from the narrative that the fate of the world rests on us alone. This manufactured quality applies to almost any multiplayer game. However, again, the Souls games insist on unifying their immersion-breaking qualities with their lore, encouraging the players to perceive Dark Souls from this meta angle. Here, for example, imagine playing Skyrim, where we're supposed to be the ultimate chosen hero, but then we occasionally see the ghosts of other players who have completed the same quests as us, and they might have even done more. Such a gameplay experience would break the immersion and diminish the personal feeling of epicness that Skyrim cultivates. Thus, the visibility of players to one another contributes to a specific kind of community experience, one that actively reminds us that our quest has nothing inherently special about it. So even the image of a fantasy hero rising above adversity is revealed to be a standard procedure, almost like some IRL job. As a result, we are prompted to consider the materiality of our quest as a manufactured idea inside of Lordran designed to mobilize the undead to labor for their monarchs. More on this later.
History is a narrative interpretation built in part out of the social theories or ideological positions that historians invent to explain the past. History may be defined essentially as a language-based manufacturing process in which the written historical interpretation is assembled or produced by historians.
Remember the legendary knight Artorias, the Abyss Walker? The man who fought off the darkness of Ulusil and saved Princess Dusk? What an absolute Chad. However, under deeper scrutiny, his legacy turns out to be, at best, questionable. Traveling into the past, we see that Artorias was far from the figure he was reported to be. Not a noble knight, but rather a failure driven mad by darkness, leaving us to complete his quest for him. This misrepresentation of history and the player's confrontation with it perfectly illustrates the postmodern skepticism of history as a concept. From a postmodern lens, history is not the past, but rather a story crafted by historians to impersonate the past. A historian cannot capture the past, nor can anyone due to our entrapment inside of language frameworks. To put it plainly, we operate inside of language, and language by its nature can only ever be metaphorical. For example, when I say the word sword, we all picture our own interpretations of what a sword looks like, how it functions, how it is made, etc. The word sword was only a stand-in, a metaphor for an actual sword. Inside of our language, history can only ever be a metaphor for the past, and never the past itself. Additionally, when considering the upbringings, beliefs, nationalities, biologies, etc. of different historians, history is revealed to be inseparable from bias. The Quest of Artorias perfectly captures this subjective reality, depicting the division between accepted history and the actual past. The historians of Lordran could not account for the presence of a time-traveling entity, and instead explained the story of Ulasil through a framework consistent with their understanding of reality. Even Princess Dusk, someone at the core of the events at Ulasil, tells a narrative that is in harmony with her own understanding of reality, only to afterwards reveal that she had been unsure of what happened and allowed a sensible narrative to substitute her memory of the events.
I was beset by a creature from the abyss. I would have perished then, were it not for the great knight Artorias. In truth, I saw little of what transpired, for mine senses were already fled.
In the legend of Artorias, we also see history being skewed for a political purpose, with the story of the Abyss Walker reinforcing ideals of knighthood, battling darkness, and Gwyn's power. The idea that Artorias was the one to triumph over Manus, father of the Abyss, validates Gwyn's sovereign power. The monarch's knight is presented as unbeatable, thus bolstering the notion that Lordran's government is more than capable of battling the coming darkness. But if history is fallible, then what gives actual meaning to our quest? How can we possibly know that what we're doing is not just a product of our material circumstances and unsubstantiated stories that serve the status quo? Thus, the player's experience of fulfilling Artorias' quest directly plays into undermining players' trust in the meta-narrative and the very concept of historical objectivity. Which leads us to ponder the potential existence of some other legitimating narrative. When we ring the second bell of awakening, the primordial serpent, King Seeker Fraubt, appears at the Fireling Shrine and illuminates the true extent of our quest.
Chosen Undead, your fate is to succeed the great Lord Gwyn, so that you may link the fire, cast away the dark, and undo the curse of the undead.
And in that instant, despite the contradictions in the world around us, we are given a greater purpose, and the meta-narrative of fire good is pleasantly strengthened. And so we continue our journey, in spite of any doubts, successfully staving off the hollowness. But things do not remain this simple for long. For deep below in the ruins of Nulando, after descending into the pitch-black void and defeating the four kings, the player might gaze into the abyss. And as it so often does, the abyss might just gaze back. If ever there was a point in which the player was certain about their purpose, this conception of reality is completely thrown into question when, in the darkness, the second primordial serpent reveals himself. Darkstalker Koth lets the player glimpse a worldview that utterly contradicts the setting's primary meta-narrative.
Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord. I am the primordial serpent. I seek to right the wrongs of the past, to discover our true Lord. But the other serpent, Fraubt, lost his sense and befriended Lord Gwyn. Undead warrior, we stand at a crossroads. Only I know the truth about your fate. You must destroy the fading Lord Gwyn, who has coddled fire and resisted nature, and become the fourth Lord, so that you may usher in an age of dark.
The game cleverly presents the two contradicting narratives through the bodies of serpents, which in many cultures are symbolic of deception. We do not have more reason to trust one serpent over the other, and both narratives are compatible with what we have witnessed thus far in Lordran. But how do we tell which one is telling the truth? And here, our crisis of meaning begins in earnest. Our worldviews naturally help us process reality, justifying why we exist and giving a foundation for judging what is true. From the angle of terror management theory, our worldviews let us distract ourselves from the certainty of death. So when we are faced with a worldview that contradicts ours, we are confronted not just with a different opinion, but with the unsteadiness of our reality foundations. This moment of confrontation rocks our being, and the subjectivity of everything blinks before us. Suddenly, we are face to face with our own mortality. Such ideological conflicts can lead to a place of deep existential anxiety as we wrestle with death itself. But from a more positive angle, Koth opens the players up to interpretations of darkness, letting us see the abyss as more than some cliché notion of evil, but rather as a realm of possibility that had been obscured by the current regime. This sentiment of abyss is more than it seems is further reflected in other parts of the game, such as the dialogue with Princess Dusk of Ulusil, who says that Manus seemed like more than the simple beast that he was made out to be.
I still think on that creature from the abyss that preyed upon me. My faculties were far from lucid, but I quite clearly sensed certain emotions. A wrenching nostalgia, a lost joy, an object of obsession, and a sincere hope to reclaim it. Could these thoughts belong to the beast from the abyss? But if that were true, then perhaps it is no beast after all.
With this new perspective, we reconsider our conception of the abyss as our enemy. Our actions up to that point are suddenly recontextualized as being based on an ideology that we did not consciously subscribe to. The meta-narratives of nobility's legitimacy and the fire's good are suddenly put to question, and while we may choose to continue adhering to the meta-narratives as we did before, our knowledge of Koth's counter-narrative prevents us from returning to the comfort of innocent certainty we previously held. Now our holding looms closer than ever, yet we are not completely deprived of our meaning, as we are offered an alternative quest, letting us continue on with a new kind of meaning, making even darkness itself an ally in our battle against Going Hollow. In the same vein, we can also consider Koth's insistence to
show the world that the truth becomes you,
which introduces us to an extremely subject-centered worldview. The truth is by its nature unstable, an ever-transforming construct of power relations. Koth's words make the player conscious of their own capacity to shape a narrative and to layer their own meaning onto the reality of Lordran. Thus, going forward, we are now fully equipped to topple the primary meta-narrative of the Age of Fire.
Truth is to be understood as a system of ordered procedures for the production, regulation, distribution, circulation, and operation of statements. Truth is linked in a circular relation with systems of power, which produce and sustain it, and to effects of power, which it induces and which extend it. A regime of truth.
We cannot go back. We can only dig deeper. It is time to address the regime of fire. Again, let us think back on the intercinematic. It taught us what is good and evil in this world, functioning as a standardized set of beliefs that we need to make sense of Lordran. But no knowledge is politically neutral, and neither is this intro. Michel Foucault, a postmodern French thinker, gives us the following insight for our analysis.
All teaching systems, which appear simply to disseminate knowledge, are made to maintain a certain social class in power and to exclude the instruments of power of another social class.
Well, who exactly benefits from our knowledge of the dying fire and the figures who defeated the everlasting dragons? Of course, it is the Age of Fire regime. Gwyn and his pantheon are at the center of the Age of Fire, so much so that they have created religions around their personas, like Way of the White and Blades of the Dark Moon. And it is this ruling class that governs humanity in Lordran. In the framework that we are presented, humanity must support its rulers or be overcome by the abyss. For humanity, both choices are suboptimal, but we are familiar with the regime of fire, so we might as well uphold the status quo. And when you think about it, this truth seems pretty suspicious. Just imagine Gwyn actually laying it out as it is.
Man, you just gotta trust me. I know it sounds suspicious that I ask you to treat me as your god. Well, I treat you as undesirables or second-class citizens at best. But trust me, bro, the world just works this way. Also, be sure to sacrifice yourself for the Age of Fire when you get the chance. For real, on me. No cap.
Thus, our inability to picture a better alternative to the Age of Fire is an intended product of the current regime's ideology, or the ideology of Gwyn. The more one looks around, especially after the confrontation with Kuth, the more one can see all the ways in which humanity suffers in the Age of Fire. Under the Fire Good and Dark Bad meta-narrative, mankind is a marginalized group, segregated from the City of Gods, imprisoned en masse, and genocided. Think back to the start of the game. Our experience in the world begins inside a prison system, as subjects of a greater monarchic power. This incarceration is framed as a necessary sacrifice, with the undead being brought to the undead asylum to await the end of the world, so as to not harm anyone else. However, when considering the idea that undeath was caused by Gwyn's extension of the Age of Fire, these undead are reframed as direct victims of the Fire meta-narrative. They are a bystander casualty made to pay for the extension of their ruler's powers. In a similar vein, throughout their journeys, players encounter other atrocities carried out to uphold the Fire Good meta-narrative, such as the New Londo ruins. Once, New Londo was a human city that attempted to gain independence from Gwyn by embracing the dark, only to have their entire city drowned by the enforcers of Gwyn. Whether or not New Londo was truly a threat to Gwyn is hard to tell. However, the fact that it was the predominantly human city only further demonstrates that human lives ultimately hold little value under Gwyn's rule. And speaking of the man himself, Gwyn, again, is treated as an actual god in the setting. However, the player journey allows us to see him as a very material person rather than some metaphysical deity. We experience the consequences of his decisions long after he sacrificed himself in the fire. Our travels take us through Gwyn's cities, walking along his steps, going down to Izalith, fighting the same demons he did, and by the end, we walk into the very same kindle of the first flame. We kill his soldiers, his friends, his family. He's what ties the whole story of Dark Souls together, and as we rise to meddle in the affairs of those considered to be gods, our quest is imbued with a grand meaning. However, there is a flip side to this grandiosity of Gwyn and his associates, as instead of becoming more enamored by these beings of great power, we are instead privy to the reality that they are as material as everything else around us. Their mortality might make us feel like giants, but our triumph comes with a cost. By toppling the orchestrators of our quest, we confront the fact that there was never a transcendental quality to our mission. Thus, we open ourselves up to further nausea of freedom, realizing that none of these gods can give us greater meaning because they are no longer greater than us. They have been reduced to physical husks torn apart for their lord souls.
God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves?
And so, as we destroy the once mighty lords, we must ask ourselves, why are we doing this? To renew the Age of Fire? But for whom? For the very gods we killed? The deconstruction of our quest never ends, but we must tell ourselves that something legitimizes our actions. We just have to reach the end and be done with the long road. We have corroded our meaning, and our quest has slowly lost the glamour that we expected out of a fantasy adventure, especially highlighted by the objective of killing our lords. Killing them becomes akin to a tedious to-do list. Damn, 2 more to go. So once we finish butchering the gods, we remain as the greatest being left in existence, a being powerful enough to prolong the Age of Fire. But with this power comes the burden of choice, and for once there is no one greater than us to tell us what to do. Koth and Frumpt might have given us suggestions, but their opinions contradict one another, leaving the player to make the final choice truly for themselves. And at last we face Gwyn. No more is he the Lord of Sunlight, now a Lord of Cinder, a walking corpse. So we wrestle with the withered god, growing to understand him as we do so. We see it clearly now. Like us, Gwyn had found meaning, but when it began to die around him, he chose to hold on to it and give himself to the first flame. Better a real death than to let the meaning of life disintegrate. And thus, after a tragic fight, he too falls to ashes, and we're left alone to make one final choice. Despite the agony of it all, we have prevailed. We have completed our quest. Through countless deaths, our own and those of our fellow humans, we are finally victorious. To falter now would be to go hollow. Now, we either accept the Age of Fire as the status quo, the only thing we know. We can finally die, but for something greater, still upholding the notion that the Age of Fire is an ultimate good, and that we must rage against the coming of the night. Or, we indeed let the Age of Fire peter out, and herald something new, rejecting the fire narrative and forfeiting the quest, stepping into whatever the uncertain future holds for us. No matter what, we have fought off the meaninglessness. We did not go hollow. Even if some things still remained unclear to us, we triumphed over all of our doubts. We won. We have beaten Dark Souls. It's not over. Not that easily. Not ever.
The flow of time itself is convoluted.
When the credits stop rolling, we are in a nightmare, a testament to the unending cyclical nature of our suffering. For as we complete our quest, we find ourselves once again in the prison cell where it all began, almost like our journey, our trials, and our victories never happened. Beating Dark Souls is but a wishful fantasy, for there can never be a final triumph over hollowing. And that is its horror. After beating Gwyn, the game does not close to the main menu or start us with a new character. Whatever the purpose of our quest was, it is now negated. We still have all of our levels, equipment, and skills from having completed the prophecy of the Undead. But we also realized that it was never about the prophecy. The narrative was but a thing to keep us occupied. New Game Plus is the point where most players are finally overcome, where the meaninglessness settles on them whether they realize it or not. We have already spent dozens and dozens of hours deconstructing the point of being in Dark Souls only to do it all again. So now, even if we continue a New Game Plus playthrough, we will do so with the knowledge that the grand quest we are on is impossible to complete, that there is no legitimizing meaning left for us to harness. The New Game Plus mechanic is infinite, but our will to keep going is painfully finite. For a moment, we had let ourselves think that we were Hercules, heroically ascending to myth and godhood, only to awaken as Sisyphus, fallen at the roots of the mountain with a boulder at our side. So now we must make the true choice. Having seen all the agony of Lordran, having personally overcome it, are we willing to do it all again? Or do we finally give up? And it is in this realization that lies the hollow, absurd horror of Dark Souls. For in completing our quest, we only find greater misery, and no matter how fiercely we resist, the monster still consumes us. So like all those who have come before us, we will go hollow. But in shattering all of our meaning, Dark Souls also performs something incredibly profound. As the credits roll and we're left to pick up the broken pieces of what had once pushed us on, we're technically stronger than we have ever been. In the end, we are not deprived of the power to endure. Earlier, we had established that Dark Souls procedurally models the postmodern crisis of meaning through player deconstruction of their own meta-narratives. Well, in creating such a nihilistic digital environment, the game offers its players a vast freedom to choose what to do in this absurd condition. At this point, thanks to Gambok's philosophical analysis of Dark Souls, it is well known that the game has deeply existentialist and absurdist philosophical themes. But in short, to keep engaging with Dark Souls, one is incentivized to understand the nature of meaning as subjective and ultimately tied to oneself. Dark Souls wakes us back up in the Undead Asylum and tells us, I'm done giving you meaning, now it's your turn. And thus, some of us continue to struggle and conjure new reasons to be in Lordran. Now, more than a decade after the game's release, there are still thousands of strugglers continuing to endure Lordran again and again, driven on in spite of the meaninglessness, achieving previously unimaginable feats such as playing Dark Souls without taking a single hit, playing it while blindfolded, or modding every enemy into Gwyn. And to this day, the words, "Don't go hollow," resound across the Souls community as a battle cry against the absurdity of it all. So, through its horrific simulation of the meaning crisis, and positioning us against hollowing, the game's true monstrosity, Dark Souls can help us understand what it means to persist in the meaninglessness of our times. And with that said, don't you dare Valhalla. Well, after months of research, writing, and video editing, it's finally complete. If you made it this far, I sincerely thank you. Please consider subscribing for future video essays of this kind, or joining my new Ko-fi community to receive additional video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and help with your own video essays. And of course, I was not alone in the making of this project. Massive thanks goes to Raymond Magdalene for his guest narration, thanks to Perrygod for their incredibly cinematic Dark Souls footage. Additionally, thank you to my partner, Abigail, for an absolute ton of editing across the whole essay, and of course, thank you to everyone who had provided feedback on the essay drafts. Now, the video is officially over, but for those interested, I would like to briefly talk about this channel's future. First off, you may have noticed I am no longer Comrade Analysis, instead I am the Media Wizard. I have a lot of plans on how to utilize the wizard aesthetic to enrich future academic content, and eventually I might actually make a video specifically about wizard aesthetics, and I promise it will all make more sense with time. Going forward, I'm going to be posting more frequently, with slightly shorter video essay content. Now, not to say that there will be no big essays, just that there will be also smaller ones too. Over the past few months, there was a complete content drought on my channel, and that's largely because Dark Souls ended up being a huge undertaking that I didn't expect it to be. So now that this Dark Souls essay is complete, I can get back to my comfort area of monster theory, body horror, and media studies, so I'm quite excited for that. If you're only here for From Software content, I respect that, but I promise you that there will be other analyses that I think you'd find just as interesting if you just give me the chance. And eventually I will be making more From Software content. Those Dark Souls and Elden Ring essays are certainly not going anywhere. As for the next video essay, I will definitely be once more tackling body horror in media, perhaps with a nautical twist this time around. And additionally, I happen to have an already written essay on the body horror of aging in the substance, so expect that quite soon. And additionally, later this month, I will be hosting a postmortem stream in which I will be rewatching this essay to add additional comments that I did not get to make in the video, talk about the process of making this video essay, and hopefully have a discussion with the chat. So, with that said, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a groovy day. Cheers.